Yes, so here we are. I'm starting from the recent evolutions of prison. After years of forgetting what prison was, at least in Belgium, a new interest raised about prison. And for the last 20 years, there's been a wide reflection about prison and a lot of reforms. And this is parallel with a new scientific interest for prison, based on, among other, based on prison space, and what seems very interesting for me, a new scientific interest for mobility. So my question is very simple. It's how our interest for mobility could help us redefine what carceral is. And I will take a sideway approach through electronic monitoring based on a Belgian experience, but I think it can be quite easily generalized. And my first question would be, is electronic monitoring an immobilizing dispositif or not? There are two ways of seeing this. Or it is a dispositif for liberation through mobilization. It means it's an alternative to prison. And so in electronic monitoring, you are freer than in prison. It seems logical. But some people say it's, on the contrary, a dispositif for constraint through immobilization, because people who would be liberated, who would be free, are now equipped with electronic devices that prevents them to move freely. So the net widening effect of the electronic monitoring would make it an immobilizing system. Sorry, it's very difficult for my French mouth to pronounce this. Both of these approaches are based on the question of the alternative effect of electronic monitoring. But what if electronic monitoring was considered for itself? So I will try to have a reflection about electronic monitoring and then go back to prison. And I will try not to go into this trap of, is electronic monitoring an alternative to prison or not? First of all, what is mobility? This is a problematic question. The first point is that I think that mobility and immobility are no absolute concepts. They are relative ones. You are not or mobile or immobile. You are mobile in relationships with another object. So you are always mobile and immobile. So it's not a question of being immobilized or mobilized, it's a question of level. Second, mobility occurs in non-physical realities too. I mean, we should not consider only the physical mobility of prisoners, of persons submitted to electronic monitoring, but also their social, for instance, their social mobility. For instance, prisons' immobilization is not only physical in a cell, in a prison, but it's also social, because they are prevented from having contacts or free contacts with the outside. And also services are prevented from entering the prison to give there what's easily accessible in the free society. On the reverse, when you are put in prison, you experience downwards social mobility, because there's a stigma and you lose your job and maybe also you lose your family, your apartment and so on. So you live a mobility, a social mobility, but a downward one. Electronic mobility itself is a way of preserving the physical mobility of people, but in order to remain them rooted in social spaces, in their family, in their work and so on. So it's a way of preserving social immobility, through a physical mobility. The aim is also to make it possible to experience a non-physical mobility through a rehabilitation program that couldn't occur inside the prison. So there is a complex mixture of physical and non-physical mobilities. These multiple spaces within which we are mobile and or immobile are joined or disjoined. I mean, when you are physically immobile, it can cause social mobilities. And on the reverse, a social mobility may require a physical mobility. So we must think about the relationship between these mobilities as a complex system of linked and dislinked or unlinked mobilities and immobilities. Fourth, we must take into account the signification of mobility. If mobility is valued for itself, as in my meaning it's the case today in our societies, immobilization is a problem. And in the Belgian penitentiary law, they clearly say in the preparatory documents that the fact of immobilization is one of the main problems of prison. So it's not something good in itself. It's the problem of the prison. But if, like in a sedentarist way of thinking, mobility is feared, then stability, immobilization, or relocation is preferred, and then prison and immobilization could be a solution. So we don't have to think that mobility is something that exists in itself. If we have to understand the relationship between the carceral and mobility, we must take into account what is the value, the social representation of mobility. We could say that there are two kinds of mobility. A drifting mobility in a society which values mobility for itself. Mobility is inevitable. It's part of the life, and it's part also of the dignity of people. So when you catch someone, you must preserve his humanity through preserving his mobility abilities. But on the other side, you could also say that there's an orthomobility, which intends to find solutions to location problems. You are trapped in a criminal environment, you have bad habits, you have bad ways of living, and then catching you, immobilizing you, and then programming an orthomobility could be a solution to relocate you at your right place in a society. Back to prison. The prison's relationship with these complex and interlocking immobilities and mobilities. How could we define them? I think there are three historical phases. The classical prison, within which prison is seen as a painful immobility. I've talked about this in other works, and if I get 20 more minutes, I could make the presentation of last year in Chicago, but I don't think that will do. Prison is an end. So the aim is to immobilize people physically, and that's it. It's a punishment, and we don't have to wait anything else from prison. But in rehabilitative programs, seen as relocation processes, then prison is a mean. You pack someone, you isolate him, and then you treat him to make it possible to relocate him at the right place. This is something else. Prison is not here for itself. It's not the virtue of immobilization, of being put in a cell. It's the fact that without isolating the individual, you cannot act on him to relocate him. Then prison is a mean. But today, I think, we shift toward a mobilitarian prison, which is something like a mobility test, trying mobilities. Prison is just an opportunity. In the preparatory documents of the Belgian law, it's clearly said that there is no objective for prison. There is no goal. We can pursue certain goals at the occasion of incarceration, but in itself, prison has no sense. And it's clearly said, the sense of imprisonment is the sense of the inmate. It's his punishment, not ours. But we could take the opportunity to make something positive while incarcerating him. So there's a continuity between prison and electronic monitoring, but not based on the fact that one would be an alternative to the other, but based on the fact that the two can be seen through the same conception of a mobility managing system within the walls and outside the walls. So what could we think about the carceral on this basis? I propose to free the carceral from some things that hinder our reflection, I think. First of all is the association, unconscious, between mobility and liberty. For us, and since a very long time, as Carceral showed it, mobility is seen as freedom. Mobility is at least the sign of liberty, except if we see a clear constraint. It lies on the sedentarist metaphysics. But how could we study trying mobilities, electronic monitoring, or activation strategies inside prison if we continue to consider that if you can move, then you are free? Should we conclude that electronic monitoring isn't a problem at any level? Or should we only, in electronic monitoring, study the part of electronic monitoring that hinders the movement, and not the aspects of electronic monitoring that force to move, to find a job, to find an apartment, and so on? So what should we do with this? So my proposal is to move from immobilization as the center of carceral to the idea of constraints on mobility. So it's not the fact that you immobilize someone, it's the fact that you constrain his mobility towards mobility or towards immobility. Constraint. In the painful immobilization system, the classical one, constraint is very clear and assumed, and punitive objective too. In the system of the teleological relocation, so the rehabilitative system, constraint is partially assumed. Yes, we pack people to treat them, but in the ideal, we would like them to participate to the process. And there is no punitive objective that's assumed. In today's trying mobility system, the mobilitarian prison and electronic monitoring, neither constraint nor punitive objective are clearly assumed, because the participation of the people is really central. Without any participation, without any agreement, electronic monitoring cannot function. So constraint must not be seen as an alternative to liberty. There is no freedom versus constraint. It's not a question of absolute constraint, but more a question of alienation, as Rosa says in Alienation and Acceleration. It's just a question of a distortion of the relationship with the environment. And so we should reflect in these terms of distortion in our relationship with mobility as a very basis for the carceral concept. But how to qualify the distorted relation to the world? I would suggest, logically, to rely on my works about mobilitarian ideology, which is within which I defined 4 imperatives, which are, in my opinion, the 4 imperatives that could define our relationship to the mobility imperative, the obligation to move. Activity. There's no rest during a sanction. It's no question of entering the cell and just waiting for 10 years and that's it. When you enter the prison or when you go on electronic monitoring, you are asked about your project. What will you do? And you are clearly demanded to do something. But it's not a question of obedience. You don't have to respect a pre-planned program. It's an activation process. So you are at the principle of your own mobility. What's asked to you is what will be your initiative to do something of your time under electronic monitoring or inside a prison. Participation is also an imperative that shows how in prison today, and in the Belgian law it's really clear, even prison is a participatory project. Inmates are demanded to participate to the prison system. And in electronic monitoring, without your participation, nothing can occur. Adaptation is the idea that you are demanded to adapt constantly to your environment and to what's asked, but also that all the dispositives must adapt in real time to the circumstances. That's what electronic monitoring is. Locating people, adapting the schedules, and also monitor constantly the conditions which come beside the electronic monitoring. Another question about the carceral in this context is, can we still describe the carceral as a carceral continuum? How do mobilities and immobilities combine in a multiple physical and non-physical space? Can we see any continuity if at the same time we are mobile in some spaces and immobile in other spaces? Without any unique space, and if mobility is not liberty, continuity between incarceration and liberty is blurred. Because what's considered by someone as more liberty can be considered by another as less liberty. And a good example of that is the people who ask to get back to prison or who refuse electronic monitoring because they feel more constrained in electronic monitoring. So the variation of liberty will depend on the space considered and on each person's situation and experience. Carceral is a spatial lasagna. It's the best I could find to describe it. I'm sorry. This spatial lasagna must be completed with the time perspective. Mobility is spatial temporal. I think that if we have to describe the carceral, we cannot rely on stable and distinct periods. We are not in the era when one day the door opened and people said, okay, you've done your time, now get out. As we've seen in Dominique's intervention, people are experiencing extended times of low-level constraint and a constant variation of the constraint they can live with. So we are evoluting towards a system of constant adaptation. And carceral, in my opinion, should be seen as a set of mobility constraints using monitoring instruments to manage trajectories. That was my conclusion. I thank you. intended to print my contribution, but I had to change my plans since I come from Brussels, and Brussels airport had little problems 1 week ago. So I don't have papers, but if you want the PDF, I got it in French and English, and I would be delighted to send it to you. Thank you.